Discovered the Mariana Trench. 7:02 p.m. What if the most terrifying place on Earth wasn't in outer space, but hiding silently beneath the ocean you swam in last summer? Most people look at the ocean and see waves, beaches, and beauty. They see dolphins jumping and sunlight dancing on the water. They feel safe. They feel like they know what the ocean is. But here is the truth nobody tells you. We know more about the surface of Mars than we know about the bottom of our own oceans. And at the very deepest, darkest, most crushing corner of those oceans lies a place so extreme, so alien, and so terrifying that for most of human history, people simply pretended it didn't exist. It is called the Mariana Trench. It stretches nearly 1,500 miles across the floor of the western Pacific Ocean, near the small island chain of Guam. At its deepest point, a narrow slot called Challenger Deep, the ocean floor sits nearly 7 miles below the surface. To put that in perspective, if you dropped Mount Everest, the tallest mountain on Earth, into the Mariana Trench, its peak would still be buried under more than a mile of water above it. The pressure at that depth is so extreme it would crush a human body like a grape in a matter of seconds. And yet, one man decided he was going down there anyway. To truly understand what Jacques Piccard did, you have to first understand just how completely unknown the deep ocean was for most of human history. For thousands of years, sailors crossed the seas with absolutely no idea what lay beneath their boats. Ancient maps were decorated with illustrations of sea monsters and warnings written in dramatic Latin, "Here be dragons." And honestly, nobody really disagreed. The ocean was deep, dark, and dangerous, and whatever lived down there was best left alone. The first serious attempt to measure ocean depth came in 1875, when the British research ship HMS Challenger set out on what became the world's first true deep-sea scientific expedition. The crew used a simple but clever method. They lowered a weighted rope over the side of the ship and measured how much rope it took before the weight hit the bottom. When they reached a spot in the western Pacific, southeast of Japan, the rope kept unspooling at an alarming rate. The sailors watched in silence as the numbers climbed. 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, 4, 5, 6, nearly 7 miles of rope before the weight finally touched solid ground. The crew marked their charts. They named the location the Mariana Trench, after the nearby Mariana Islands. Scientists around the world raised their eyebrows, wrote down the numbers, and then quietly moved on. Nobody seriously talked about going down there. The idea was laughable. It was physically impossible. The pressure alone would destroy any vessel ever built. The Mariana Trench became one of those fascinating facts that people mentioned at dinner parties and then promptly forgot about. But that was before the Piccard family entered the picture. The story of Jacques Piccard really begins not in the ocean but high above the clouds, with his remarkable father Auguste Piccard. Auguste was a Swiss physicist, inventor, and explorer born in 1884. A man who looked at the world and saw nothing but unanswered questions waiting to be solved. In 1931, when most scientists were content to study the upper atmosphere from the ground using telescopes and instruments, Auguste decided to go up there himself. He designed a pressurized aluminum cabin attached to a giant hydrogen balloon and floated up into the stratosphere, reaching an altitude of over 51,000 feet, higher than any human being had ever gone at that time. He came back alive, full of data, and absolutely buzzing with excitement. The whole world was amazed. Auguste became an international celebrity overnight. Newspapers ran his photograph on their front pages. Children wanted to grow up to be him. And sitting at home, watching all of this with enormous wide eyes, was his young son, Jacques Piccard, born in Brussels in 1922. Jacques grew up in a household where impossible things happened regularly. His father didn't just dream big, he actually did big things. He built the machines. He did the math. He strapped himself into dangerous contraptions and went places no human had ever been. For Jacques, growing up in that environment, the question was never whether to push limits. The question was always simply, which limits to push next? When Auguste turned his restless mind toward the deep ocean, reasoning that if a pressurized vessel could protect a human in the thin air of the stratosphere, perhaps it could also protect one against the crushing pressure of the deep sea, Jacques was right there beside him. Father and son began designing together, sketching plans, running calculations, dreaming up something the world had never seen before. They were not just a father and son. They were two explorers who shared the same burning fire inside them, and together they were about to change the world forever. The vessel they created was called the Trieste, named after the Italian city where much of its construction was completed. It was unveiled in 1953, and it looked absolutely nothing like what most people imagined a submarine would look like. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't elegant. It looked, honestly, a little bit like a giant metal float attached to a small round ball hanging underneath it. The upper section was a large buoyancy tank filled with gasoline, not for fuel, but because gasoline is lighter than water, which helped the vessel sink slowly and rise back up. Underneath the tank hung the real heart of the machine, a small, thick-walled spherical cabin made of steel walls nearly 5 inches thick, just big enough to fit 2 people sitting very close together. It had one tiny circular porthole window made of cone-shaped plexiglass, cleverly designed to get stronger under pressure rather than crack. There was no engine, no propeller, no steering in the traditional sense. The Trieste simply descended by gravity and came back up by dropping iron ballast weights from the bottom. Once you went down, you were entirely at the mercy of physics. It was, in many ways, the most beautifully simple and terrifyingly vulnerable craft ever built by human hands. Auguste and Jacques tested the Trieste in progressively deeper waters throughout the 1950s, each dive pushing deeper than the last. The United States Navy watched with growing interest. The Cold War was at its peak, and the military had strong reasons to understand what the deep ocean could hold, for submarines, for strategy, for science. In 1958, the Navy purchased the Trieste and began preparing it for the ultimate dive, all the way to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. They paired Jacques with a sharp, steady young naval officer named Lieutenant Don Walsh. The two men trained together, studied together, and spent months preparing for a dive that many of their colleagues quietly believed would kill them both. The day of the dive, January 23, 1960, the weather in the Pacific was rough. The support ship rocked on choppy grey waves as Jacques and Don made their final checks. There was no dramatic ceremony, no grand speech, no crowd of cheering supporters. Just 2 men in heavy clothing, a steel ball barely bigger than a walk-in closet, and an ocean floor nearly 7 miles below them. They climbed inside. The hatch was sealed. And the Trieste began to sink. At first, there was still some pale blue light filtering down from the surface above them. Jacques pressed his face to the tiny porthole and watched the world he knew slowly disappear, the rippling surface, the distant blur of their support ship, the last traces of sunlight fading into darkness. Within minutes, they were surrounded by nothing but black. An absolute, total, suffocating black that pressed against the porthole like a wall. There was nothing to see. Nothing to hear except the occasional groan and creak of the steel walls adjusting to the growing pressure outside. Every sound made both men's hearts jump a little faster. The descent took nearly 5 hours. 5 hours of slow, steady, silent sinking into the unknown. To pass the time, Jacques and Don checked their instruments, monitored the pressure readings, and spoke to each other in calm, careful voices. Outside, the ocean pressed harder and harder against the Trieste with every passing minute. By the time they reached a depth of 30,000 feet, the pressure outside their tiny cabin had reached a staggering 16,000 pounds per square inch, roughly the equivalent of 50 jumbo jets stacked on top of a single human hand. The steel walls were holding, but barely a man alive could forget what was happening just inches beyond them. Then, at around 30,000 feet, something happened that stopped both their hearts completely. A sharp, explosive crack rang through the cabin, loud and sudden like a gunshot, and both men froze absolutely still. In that terrible second, they both thought the same thing. This is it. The vessel is breaking. We are going to die down here in the dark and no one will ever find us. But the instruments showed no breach. The pressure readings stayed steady. After a long, shaking breath, they determined that one of the outer plexiglass window panes in the entry tunnel had cracked under the pressure, serious, but not fatal. The inner porthole was still holding perfectly. With quiet courage, they made the decision that only true explorers can make. They kept going down. At 10:56 in the morning, the floodlights of the Trieste illuminated something pale and flat below them. The ocean floor. They had arrived. They had actually arrived. Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh had just become the first human beings in all of history to reach the deepest point on the surface of the Earth, Challenger Deep, sitting at 35,814 feet below sea level, nearly 7 miles straight down. Jacques pressed his face against the porthole and stared at the bottom of the world in complete silence. What he saw took his breath away entirely. The floor was covered in soft, pale, cream-colored sediment, ancient particles of rock and shell that had been drifting down from the surface for millions upon millions of years and now lay undisturbed in perfect stillness. And then, moving slowly across that ancient floor, was a small flatfish, pale and translucent, gliding calmly through the darkness as if it had not a single care in the world. Tiny shrimp drifted through the water nearby. Microscopic life flickered in the beam of the floodlights. Life. Actual, undeniable, thriving life, at the most extreme, most impossible, most crushing place on the entire planet. Scientists had been certain, absolutely certain, that nothing could survive those conditions. No light, no warmth, pressure strong enough to compress steel. And yet here was a fish, peacefully going about its quiet life at the very bottom of the Earth, as if it had always been there, unbothered and unhurried. Jacques later said that moment, that single image of that small pale fish gliding across the floor of the world, was the most humbling thing he had ever witnessed in his entire life. It didn't just break a record. It broke an assumption. It told the world that life is far more stubborn, far more creative, and far more extraordinary than anyone had dared to believe. They spent only 20 minutes at the bottom before beginning the long, slow float back to the surface. 20 minutes after nearly 5 hours going down and another 3.5 hours coming back up. But those 20 minutes rewrote the entire history of science. They proved beyond any doubt that life could exist in conditions previously thought completely incompatible with biology. They proved that the human spirit, fueled by enough curiosity and enough courage and enough stubbornly clever engineering, could reach the most unreachable corners of our world. They proved that no place on Earth was truly beyond the reach of a determined human being willing to sit with the fear and keep going anyway. When the Trieste finally broke the surface and the hatch was thrown open, and Jacques and Don gulped in the salty Pacific air, the support crew above erupted in cheers. The two men climbed out blinking in the daylight, salt water streaming down the sides of the vessel, the grey Pacific sky above them the most beautiful thing either of them had ever seen. They had gone to the bottom of the world and come back. They had done the impossible. And the world would never quite see the ocean the same way again. Jacques Piccard spent the rest of his life as one of the world's most passionate advocates for ocean conservation. He believed deeply that you cannot protect something you do not understand, and he dedicated decades to helping people understand just how vast, how alive, and how fragile the ocean truly is. He designed new submersibles, participated in more dives, wrote books, gave lectures, and worked tirelessly to convince governments and industries to treat the ocean with the respect it deserved. He passed away peacefully in Switzerland in November 2008, at the age of 86, leaving behind a legacy that sits quietly at the very bottom of the sea. Today, the Mariana Trench remains one of the most mysterious and least explored places on our entire planet. Less than 25 people in all of human history have descended to Challenger Deep, a number smaller than the list of humans who have walked on the surface of the moon. Modern expeditions using robotic submersibles have since discovered entire ecosystems thriving in the trench, strange transparent fish with no eyes, ghostly white sea cucumbers, armies of tiny crustaceans called amphipods carpeting the ocean floor in their millions, and microbes living inside the rock itself, surviving on chemistry alone in the complete absence of sunlight. Every expedition returns with something new. Every dive reveals another layer of a story that is still being written. The ocean covers 71% of the surface of our planet, and yet scientists estimate that we have only explored and mapped roughly 20% of it. The deep ocean, everything below 200 meters, remains largely unknown, largely unseen, and almost entirely unmapped. It is, by every honest measure, the largest unexplored wilderness left on Earth. And somewhere in that wilderness, at the very deepest and darkest and most extreme point of all, lies the place where two brave men once pressed their faces to a tiny porthole and watched a small fish swim peacefully across the floor of the world. Jacques Piccard went down into the darkness not because it was safe, not because it was comfortable, not because anyone told him it was a good idea. He went because the question was there and nobody else was answering it. He went because his father had taught him that impossible things are just problems that haven't been solved yet. He went because the ocean was calling, deep and dark and irresistible, and he was the kind of man who always answered. And in those 20 quiet minutes at the bottom of the earth, surrounded by crushing pressure and total darkness and the impossible sight of living creatures going about their business in conditions that should have made life impossible, Jacques Piccard gave the whole human race a gift that money cannot buy and words can barely describe. The beautiful, humbling, world-changing knowledge that life is everywhere, curiosity is everything, and the deepest places are never quite as empty as we fear.